There's a lot to cover in this week's Deepen Your Learning, but the idea is we're going to start off with more simple organisms and go to more complex organisms. Though right away I want to say that evolution is not about increasingly complex things coming about in a particular order, because that's not always how it works. It often goes sideways or even backwards at times. But looking at it like this helps us to understand that over time we've seen very simple organisms. Today we see very complex organisms. And this is how we got to that evolutionarily. So the first part of this is that there were different biological molecules. These are 4 biological molecules: lipids like fats, nucleic acids like DNA, carbohydrates, sugars, and proteins. And these were able to self-assemble, so meaning these were existing in much less complex forms, and they can put themselves together without anything doing it for them. And scientists have been able to replicate that in the lab. Once we've got all of these assembled and then actually put together all the way, we get a cell. Then cells got increasingly complex over time. The first cells were called prokaryotic cells. They still exist today, things like bacteria. They have very simple cell systems. They have DNA like all cells do, but it's just kind of free floating in here. That's what that orange thing is. Cells became eukaryotic, presumably when one prokaryotic cell kind of engulfed another prokaryotic cell and they worked together. And like the outer one maybe providing protection, the inner one providing energy or something like that, until it became like a permanent situation. And then we got eukaryotic cells where we have the DNA inside a nucleus, and then a lot of organelles within the cell doing all sorts of different functions. Things like sponges and jellies are very simple eukaryotic animals. And so they have relatively simple cells, but they still have this setup. Skipping quite a lot from single-celled organisms to the next step, because this is a really very long story. We have jawless fishes. So jawless fishes did have a lot of things, that stuff that we talked about, even jellies and sponges do not have. They had eyes, which also implies they had things like a brain. Jellies and sponges don't have things like that. They had things that were like teeth and jaws, but not jaws as we have them now. There are a couple examples of jawless fishes that are surviving today. One of them is a hagfish, if you want to look it up. They're pretty gross, but also really cool. Then as we got to more complex fishes, they started to develop harder parts. So they had no skeleton. What that means is they didn't have a bony skeleton made out of bone. They had skeletons made out of cartilage, like sharks, which obviously still exists today. But then they developed the ability to use the calcium in their environment to form bones, scales, hard teeth, and things like that, which made them much more effective predators than they were before without those adaptations. The next step is as fish became amphibians. So their limbs, which were previously fins, started to develop more. They had more strength, they could bear more weight, and so those fishes could come onto land, at least for brief periods to start, and then they could spend increasingly more time on land. There are lobe-finned fishes, at least one species, I think maybe 2, that are surviving today, and they have these strong fins, and they also have, in addition to gills, lungs. They have lungs and gills, and obviously by the time we got to amphibians, the gills were gone in the adult form of the organism, and they had those developed limbs to bear their weight on land. Next is amphibians into reptiles. I know that's covered up on here. But there's a main difference here is the eggs. So amphibian eggs look very much like fish eggs. They are porous, so the water in the environment can move in and out. That is helpful if you are actually in an aquatic environment because it kind of keeps the eggs fresh and healthy. But if you're going to be on land, and amphibians, as we know, are already spending at least some of their life on land, then if you want to have your eggs on land too, they cannot be porous like amphibian eggs because they'll just dry out. So reptile eggs are the first example in evolutionary history of amniotic eggs. So they have a hard outside, and the animal can develop entirely within the egg, protected from the outside environment. And eggs from reptiles on are all considered amniotic eggs. Then we're also skipping a few steps here, but we have reptiles into mammals, and a main step in this scenario is the body temperature. So reptiles' bodies are not regulating their own temperature. They're going to be subject to their environment, which means that their activity and everything is going to depend on what their environment is like. But mammals are able to regulate their body temperature regardless of environment, unless it's very, very hot or very, very cold. And in that way, they're able to remain active despite different weather situations, and it's going to give them a lot of advantages for all kinds of things like finding food and using the environment more effectively because they're not being controlled by those daily temperature fluctuations. Now, next we have mammals to primates. Primates are a type of mammal. And here, this is going to be more about the body shape than any of the other types of adaptations that we've talked about so far. So there are things like binocular vision, hands and feet and tails that all have the ability to grasp. So they're going to be able to be a lot more effective climbers than anything that comes before. Color vision, not necessarily like ours, but still able to perceive some colors like early primates, and some primates today still are able to perceive simple colors like red, but that's a really big advantage because then you can see ripe fruit. Having nails to protect fingers and toes, teeth that are specialized so you can focus on certain types of food or eat multiple, like a more varied diet, and then larger brains, which are also going to contribute to all different types of thinking and processing, which can contribute to things like tool use, etc. Then there were precursor hominins. So the definition of that is a primate that has a fully upright posture, so they're not on their hands and feet to walk everywhere. But they're not necessarily only going to be on their feet when they're walking around. They're still occupying an arboreal environment in the trees, so they're not vastly different. They're not on the plains or anything like that yet. Then we have Australopiths. So they had a much more fully upright posture, so they could do that for extended periods of time. You can see a difference in their skeletal structure that allowed them to do that. And since they were able to walk upright for so long, they were also able to venture further from the forest environment. So they were found in plains and grasslands. So this is a very simplified version of this process that we just talked about. And we have the jawless fishes, which had vertebra not necessarily made out of bone yet, then jaws, cartilaginous fishes. You can see the shark still surviving, bony skeletons, bony fishes, lungs with lobefin fishes, limbs with amphibians, amniotic egg, scales and claws with reptiles, and then all those other things with the rest of the steps that we talked about. Again, I know this is a lot really fast, so if you have any questions about any of these steps that you'd like to go over more, please feel free to let me know.